Okay, here we go. So I'm Tim Rogers, I'm a mathematician, and I hope you're all wide awake because I'm going to try and cram 2 years worth of research into 5 minutes. But don't worry, it's not maths research really, but the maths is hidden. I've been thinking about species, okay? And here's the question, why do species exist at all? Okay? So we have the shark, we have the octopus. Why isn't there a continuum of different creatures with all kinds of different traits in between these two? Where's my sharktopus, right? Why isn't that a thing? So there's a book about this. We can read this book. Maybe that'll have the answer. But actually, famously, Darwin doesn't actually tell us what the origin of species is. In fact, he's not even that clear on what a species is. This is what Darwin has got to say about species. He says, "We shall have to treat species as merely artificial combinations made for convenience." That's not very encouraging, is it? So if we don't know what a species is, how can we possibly know where it comes from? Well, maybe I don't need to worry too much about what Darwin says because a lot's happened since then, and I've got the whole sum total of human knowledge at my fingertips, ready to go on the internet. I can type into Google how to define a species, and the internet will tell me what it's all about. Sex! It's all about sex. So these two may make an adorable couple, but unfortunately they are not going to be able to reproduce because they are members of different species. So that's the definition. Okay, we're sorted. I can relax. Well, hang on a minute. There are some well-documented cases where you have groups of populations where each population can mate with its neighbours, but the two guys at the top can't mate with each other. So how are we going to define a species in this case? And it gets worse than that when we think about smaller creatures. So here's some meiofauna. These are tiny little worms, some nematodes. So these make up the bulk of the ecosystem of the Earth. And we don't know about the species here. We can't find them. We don't know how to define them. And we can't look at these guys and see who's mating with each other. So hopefully technology to the rescue with the genetic species concept. So the idea is we DNA sequence all of these guys. We get their DNA sequences and we're looking for clusters in those sequences. We're looking for similar sequences that are well separated from other groups of similar sequences. So here I've coloured them in red and blue. So these guys have a lot of DNA in common and they're very different from this other group in blue. Okay, but that's only a handful of sequences and it's only two groups, two clusters. So what about millions and millions of sequences, the whole population? What are we going to do then? We can build a phylogenetic tree. This is like the ancestral tree. We look at how closely related these individual guys are and we group them together in bigger and bigger and bigger groups. And eventually we'll go from grouping families to grouping entire species. But the question is, where on this tree is the species? So how do I separate genetic difference between individuals of the same species between genetic difference between species? Where do I draw the line? So one idea is to look at how many branches this tree has. So imagine going back in time and I count how many times I slice this graph. And I should see this characteristic curve that drops off as time goes on. And it has this characteristic shape. It has these two steep regions and a plateau. And they have names. So the first thing describes intraspecific variation. So this is variation, genetic variation within the same species. Then there's a gap. That's a genetic difference between typical species. And then there's another drop-off. And this is a genetic difference between species. And we should be able to see that gap. In the real data, it's not quite so clear. So some of these curves do have it. These are all phylogenetic trees of real animals. The guys on the bottom, the two curves on the bottom, do have that kind of kink, that sort of step. But the ones on the top just drop off smoothly with distance. How are we going to define species in this case? What differentiates these two populations, weirdly, is body size. So these guys are beetles and flies, I think. And they see the kink. They're big creatures and they see the kink. The smaller creatures, the nematodes, or wormy things, they just drop off smoothly with distance. So we built a mathematical model. Oh my god, his genes have died. This used to have ones and zeros then, okay? So it's not just empty, right? There's birth with a small chance of mutation, and there's death due to competition. So imagine that's a gene sequence. So this whole population rumbles on, and what we find is that clusters, genetic clusters form, so species form, only when the product mu-k is small. So if I have a really high mutation rate, I'm not going to form well-defined clusters. Or if I have a huge population, I'm not going to form well-defined clusters. And when we compare our model to the data, we see that the small creatures, the top four curves there, they look more like the blue line here, which is our model in the case where species haven't formed. So small, phylogenetic trees of small creatures look like they don't form species. Why small? Because the smaller you are, the larger your population size is likely to be, and the less chance you are to form nicely delineated genetic clusters. So maybe there are no species smaller than 1 millimetre. And you can read more on my website. Thank you.